Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville, with 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer Mike Miller.
Welcome to episode number 76 of Mike's on Mike, brought to you through the courtesy of Dr. Alan Bliss and the supporters of the Jacksonville History Center and its parent organization, the Jacksonville Historical Society. Visit them online at jackshistory.org. I'm Scott Westerman, and I produce the show for our three favorite observers of the political scene, Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and our ringmaster, Mike Miller. This week, we are breaking format for some personal reminiscences on the occasion of President Jimmy Carter's passing. Mike Tolbert, you were an aide to Jacksonville Mayor Jake Godbold during the Carter presidency. Tell us about the relationship between the leader of the free world and the leader of the bold new city of the South.
Well, it was a close one, and like everything Jake did, it was exciting. I can remember he hated to fly. Jake did not like to fly. But when he became mayor and when Carter was president, he had like frequent flyer miles to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Carter administration and with the president. And I remember one particular visit. There's so many, but I remember one particular early on. It was right after we did Colt Fever in 1979. And I think it may have been his first trip as mayor because it was in the summer and he'd been sworn in July 1st. And when he got to Washington, I think Martha Barrett was with him and a few others on the staff. But when he got to Washington and they got to the White House, they were ushered into a big conference room for a meeting. All of a sudden, Hamilton Jordan, who was Carter's chief of staff, came in off the White House tennis courts in his tennis uniform, or whatever you call it, outfit. And Jake started talking right away about what Jacksonville needed, what he needed to do. And Hamilton stopped him. And he said, wait a minute, Mayor. I want you to tell me how the hell you got 50,000 people in the Gator Bowl to watch a helicopter land. And that started their relationship. Jake made a ton of trips to Washington. Carter came down here, came to Jacksonville, 4 different times. Hightower can speak to all of that. But they were very close. And I know that where Jake is now, he's probably already looked up Carter, and they're probably talking about peanuts. I remember a lot about what I read and what I saw on TV, but one of the things that I take away from his life is while he had his hand on the codes and he could start nuclear war, he impressed me as a very gentle soul. I think he was a very gentle soul who probably had an iron backbone, but I think he was a very gentle soul.
Mike Hightower, your relationship with the former president was much more personal. Tell us about the day that Jimmy Carter changed your life.
There was a fundraiser for Lloyd Benson, and it was at the Mulebach Hotel. And it was a typical Texas cocktail party because there were 10,000 people there in a room that was supposed to seat 8,000. Anyway, there were 7 doors, and everybody was waiting to get in for free booze and free food. And so when the doors opened up, it was a mass entrance, and I picked door A. And so I got pushed into door A, and I literally, in so many ways, got pushed into this corner. And when I got pushed into this corner, there was a man standing there and with a big smile. And everybody had a name tag. And he reached out and took my hand and he says, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Carter. I'm the outgoing governor of Georgia and I'm running for president." And I said, "Wow, my name is Mike Hightower and I am from Jacksonville, Florida, and I'm the new secretary of the Democratic Party." I gave him my card that I'd had printed up. I had 500 of those cards printed up. And by the way, I still have 496 of those cards if anybody wants one. And so we sat and talked for about 20 minutes. And so I was really impressed with the guy. And of course, we went our different ways. And of course, Askew, I was there part of the Askew gang from Florida. Askew was also running to be president. So anyway, I come home and I tell my wife, I said, "I met the guy I'm going to work for." And she said, "Who was that?" And I said, "Jimmy Carter." And her response was, "Jimmy who?" Which everybody at that time said Jimmy who. So anyway, that was in December. It was 50 years ago this month, gentlemen. So the following March, I get a call from him, and we meet at the Blackstone building, which, by the way, was Mike Tolbert's hangout. And so we had lunch at the Blackstone building. And the upshot of that meeting was he took a napkin and he drew the state of Florida, and he put X's in about 12 to 13 places. And he put an X in Jacksonville, and he said, I want you to help me. And I want you to, if you will, you want to help me, I want you to help me in Jacksonville. And he said, if you can get me within 10 percentage points of George Wallace, we can win the state of Florida. And that was key. You know, thanks to a whole lot of folks and everything that went on, we won.
The program is Mike's on Mike, and we're remembering the life and times of former President Jimmy Carter. Mike Miller, what was your first connection with the Carters?
I had been called by the Democratic Party, the federal National Democratic Party, because I was doing a nighttime talk show. Our nighttime talk show back in those days in the 70s, there were actually people listening to AM radio in the evening hours. And my show was on from 8 p.m. till midnight. And it was very popular. We were the number one rated show, except for one rock and roll station, which had outpulled us. But I mean, we were the only news or talk station that was on top. So we get a phone call from the National Committee, and they said, Rosalynn Carter is going to be in Jacksonville, Mr. Miller, and we thought it would be a good idea, considering your audience, that she come on your show. Would you be open to having her come on? And I had said at the same time, I said, listen, I'd love to meet Mrs. Carter. Quite obviously, there's much I'm sure we can talk about, but I'll only do this if you'll guarantee that I'll get Jimmy on as well at a future date. And they guaranteed it, which was surprising. And even more surprising is they lived up to their promise. So right around the New Hampshire primary, and I've been searching like crazy to try to get the exact date, but right around the New Hampshire primary time, the call comes in to say, Mr. Carter, Governor Carter at the time, will be available on Friday night. Can we squeeze him on your show? Of course, I'm booked up, guys. I don't have time for the governor and future possible president. I said, of course. So he got there. My show started at 8. He got there around 7:30, believe it or not. And when he came in, he said, is there somewhere you and I can go and get to know each other before we get on microphone and greet people? And I said, of course. So we went back into our general manager's office, as a matter of fact. And he and I sat and talked for about 15 minutes to get to know each other. The one thing that struck me about Jimmy Carter more than anything else, besides being an incredible gentleman, he was more interested in what I thought than I was interested in what he thought. He just did not stop asking me questions. What do you think about this? What did you think about this? How do you think people in your audience would feel about this? So we really got to know each other very well. Well, in the meantime, in that 15-minute segment where he and I were off in another room, we then came out, and the studio, and this is Orlando now at WDBO Radio, the old studio on Ivanhoe Boulevard. The studio had a large window that looked out into the lobby because we wanted to be the window in the world, window of the world. So to my surprise, my producer comes in and says, the media is here, Mike. They want to know if they can go in the studio with you. And Carter and I both looked at each other, and I said, no, I don't want them in the studio with us. Too distracting. They can be out there. They can see us. We can see them. So to my amazement, Sam Donaldson was there, CBS was there, ABC was there, the local media was all there. We were just flooded with cameras. I'd never seen anything like that before in my life. And I got to tell you guys, I was nervous as hell. I mean, I really was. I was more nervous at that than I had been when I was sitting with Carter in the other room and he and I were getting to know each other. So he sat down in the studio with me, and the cameras are rolling out there, and they're all pressing their noses against the glass. And I go to introduce him, and I said, ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored tonight to have the governor of the great state of Georgia, Jimmy Walker. And I hear a whisper, and he said, that's Carter. And I said, excuse me? He said, that's Jimmy Carter. I said, I know. What did I say? And he said, you said Jimmy Walker. I said, well, why would I say Jimmy Walker? You're Jimmy Carter. This goes on. And I'm looking outside, and Donaldson and everybody else is like saying, who is this idiot that the governor and hopeful presidential candidate is sitting across? But anyhow, that's what made the whole show, obviously. And then we went on for about an hour, and it was a great program and had a wonderful time.
Mike, for those of us who remember that time in popular culture, the Jimmy Walker era was an easy one to make.
Dynamite. He had, at Good Times was his television program, of course, a very popular Good Times show. So anyhow, I need to fast forward here. I stayed in Orlando from 72 until 77. And in 77, I went to Hartford, Connecticut. And the owner of our radio station had just bought a TV station in town. So he owned both radio and TV. And he had this big unveiling of the television station and the new ownership and everything else. And lo and behold, his special guests were both Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, who came to this great unveiling. Now, why did they come? Because the owner of the television and radio station had a lot of money and donated a lot of money to the Carter campaign. So that was their way of paying him back. So I went over to the table where he was sitting with the station owner and everything else. And I went and I said, at the time, Mr. President, because it had been over by that time, Mr. President, I wanted to introduce myself, or actually reintroduce myself. I'm Mike Miller. We met in Orlando. He said, I know who you are. Jimmy Walker. Huh? I abruptly turned around and walked back to my seat at another table. But those were two of the times that I got to meet him. And in Detroit, I went to Detroit in 1980. And I think you've got a picture you're going to show of me sitting with Rosalind and with Jimmy Carter at the studios of WXYZ, where I was broadcasting from. And there I was doing the morning show. So I interviewed him there, and then interviewed him again after he left office. So I had a chance of meeting him 4 times, interviewing him 3 times, and it was a magical moment each time I met him, and certainly had the opportunity to interview him.
What do you think was his magic and his communication style that so connected with you?
He was relatable, and that was very important. There are some people that you'd like to sit down and share a beer with, and there are other people that you wouldn't want to even be in the same saloon with. He was the kind of guy that you'd want to have in your kitchen having a beer with. He was just that. The honesty poured out of him, the sincerity poured out of him. I remember once, and I think trying to remember I met Ted Kennedy when I was in Boston. Got to interview him. But I remember very vividly that when I shook his hand after I was introduced to him, he was looking at everybody in the room but me. And then we had the interview afterwards, so obviously he had to look at me at that point. But there are those kinds of people when you meet and they're looking to see who else is in the room and who else do they want to meet, more so than they cared about you. Jimmy Carter was the kind of guy, and Bill Clinton was good at this too, by the way, who not only would grab your hand, but he would also grab your arm in the same way and shake your arm and your hand at the same time to give you the feeling that you're the only person that matters to him at that moment. And that's something that both Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter shared that Ted Kennedy didn't, I'm afraid. But that's what really got to me. He was just so real and relatable.
Mike Tolbert, you've worked for a lot of politicians, and you had a chance to work on the Jimmy Carter campaign. Why didn't you get on the train?
Back in those days, I was an aide to Mayor Tansler, and I did a lot of political stuff for him and whatever he wanted me to do. And Carter came to town during the early phases of that campaign to do some politicking. I'm sure he met with Hightower at that point. And he met with the mayor. And after the meeting with the mayor, he asked me if I would go across the street to the Blackstone building with he and one of his aides to have lunch. And of course, I jumped all over it. And I was born in Atlanta, so I'm a Georgia boy at heart. And I jumped all over it. And we went over there and had a nice lunch. But during lunch, he offered me a job in his campaign, which surprised me. I didn't think that was the purpose of lunch. But I very nicely said, I appreciate your thought, your offer, but I think I'm going to stay where I am because in my mind, I had a good job. I was working for Mayor Tansler. We were doing things and having fun. And I didn't want to change jobs and take a risk on somebody who didn't, at that point, look like he had much of a chance to win. That was a damn long-term consequence. If I'd have said yes instead of no, like I said, I could have been Hightower.
Mike Hightower, when Jimmy Carter was on the road, he often did things that few other presidents ever did.
Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn Carter stayed in people's home. And they talked with people. And of course, they were both extraordinarily wedded to their faith. And I think that was an important time in our country. But Mike Miller made an important thing is how he was relatable. And when he talked to you, whether it was in a good situation or a bad situation, and I had a couple of those when I didn't do everything I should have done the right way. But when he was a great tutor, he was a great mentor, but he was a great listener. And those times, and there were many of them, as I was thinking back, getting ready for this show, the number of times that I had those one-on-one conversations, one with the candidate Jimmy Carter, and then after he was president, it was never about him. It was about, one, he always asked about the family, he always asked about my family, but he was interested in, from my perspective, of what was going on.
The program is Mike's on Mike. We're remembering the life and times of former President Jimmy Carter. Mike Tolbert, we remember back in 1979, Russia's invasion of Afghanistan and how that led to the U.S.'s non-participation in the 1980 Olympics. How did that impact you?
Well, it sounds strange that it would, but one of the things that Mayor Godbold wanted to do in trying to make things happen in Jacksonville was he went after the Olympic gymnastics trials, where they picked the gymnasts who were going to go to the Olympic team. And at that time, way back then, Jacksonville only had one gymnastics studio where kids could go. It wasn't a big sport in Jacksonville, but he felt like it would be exciting and be something to do. So the kids who wanted to be gymnasts in the Olympics came to Jacksonville for a week-long competition. I remember guys like Bart Connor, who went on to be legendary, Peter Vidmar. Bella Carosi was the women's coach, the really famous gymnastics coach. I ran those Olympic trials. I got to know those kids very, very closely. Became still friends with a couple of them all these years later. They were so excited about going to the Olympics, winning and being able to go and compete in the Olympics against the rest of the world. And when that happened, when he decided to boycott the Olympics, most of those young people felt like the rug had been pulled out from under them. They didn't really understand why they were having to pay the price for whatever was going on over in Russia and Afghanistan. And I think what I've read and heard over the years is as they've grown older and seen the world in it from different perspectives, they have a different attitude pretty much today than they did back then. But it was very understandable. Now, the good news is, 4 years later, in 1984, we got them again. They came back. It was so successful in Jacksonville the first time that they came back here. And Mary Lou Retton was one of them at that point. Bart was still with them. Vidmar was still. Several guys who had been here earlier and girls who had been here earlier. We had a terrific gymnastics competition. We were on national television on Friday night in prime time on NBC for the first time in history. And then when it was over, they went to the Olympics and they just cleaned up in medals. Before the Olympics, I'll tell you a quick little aside. Before the Olympics, Bart Connor and I were talking about once he was an older gymnast. He was the old man of the whole pack. I think he may have been 24. And we had gotten very close. He was very smart. And we had talked about when he was all over, him coming back to Jacksonville. He liked Jacksonville. And he and I going into business together. He joined my little PR company. And he goes off, and I think he won 2 gold medals at that Olympics. And I remember sending him a telegram, and it said, "Dear partner, congratulations." Of course, he didn't become my partner. He had bigger fish to fry once he won those 2 gold medals. So, but that did impact pulling us out of the Olympics. It impacted me more because of the kids I knew and the young people that had competed so hard and were looking so forward to going.
Mike Miller, how will history remember Jimmy Carter?
Well, we may have to really wait for history to reveal itself, I think, and decide just what they want to really focus on. And I think that's what's very important. Obviously, Jimmy Carter was in office, so therefore you end up owning the very high inflation that we saw, the 1979 oil crisis, and the miles of lines that people had to wait in to buy $10 worth of gas, which at that time was a lot. It was a very tough time. It was also the time, of course, where we had hostages being held in Iran and the whole Iranian oil crisis, which caused the shortage of oil. That's what he's going to be, unfortunately, remembered for in many ways. On the positive side, and part of this has obviously a personal impact to me, is as you mentioned before, Scott, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, which happened, over 50 years ago, and folks, it's almost 50 now. But it is one of the longest, most successful alliances that Israel has ever had with an Arab country, of course. And I think that has probably kept the Middle East in a manageable level, because if there had not been that agreement between Egypt and Israel, from my perspective, Egypt could have joined the other Arab countries, particularly after the 73 Yom Kippur War, which could have been devastating for Israel. So I think that's going to be probably the greatest thing that he'll be remembered for. But keep in mind, folks, there was no federal Department of Education before Jimmy Carter. There was no federal Department of Energy before there was Jimmy Carter. Seatbelts were not mandatory before Jimmy Carter. There are so many things that he did in that respect that people don't think about, that the media really is not even covered in doing their obituaries of Carter. But those are things that were very important, and they impacted all of us, and in many cases saved thousands of lives, particularly seatbelts. Can you imagine what it would be like today with today's traffic and today's population if people no longer decided to wear seatbelts anymore? Just look at the statistics. That gives you an idea. So I think, just off the top of my head, those are a few of the things I think he'll be remembered for. The negative will be on the oil crisis, I think, and the positive will be on the Middle East peace treaty.
Mike Tolbert, you have given a lifetime of service to the city of Jacksonville. How do you assess President Carter's legacy after his presidency?
Oh, my goodness. Well, going back to what Miller said, I've been watching a lot of TV and reading a lot of newspapers around his death. And what historians will start saying, I'm seeing a different narrative develop around his life now after his death. And hopefully that'll take hold. In my mind, at a time when we were lost, he brought us back to where a sense of decency and honesty. And I think that's so badly needed. As I think I said before, he was an humble man who walked strongly. And I'm not sure I know how to answer your question. I think he was a proud man of the South, and all of us except Miller there, being Southerners, had a sense of pride about him.
Mike Hightower, you get the last word. How will you remember Jimmy Carter?
ditto to what Mike Tolbert said, but I also, when I think of Jimmy Carter, I think of his partner for 77 years and the First Lady, Rosalind Carter. They were a team. And when they left the White House, as we've shared previously, it took them 2 years to decide what they wanted to do. So you sort of think from 80 to 82, 83, and then they put together the Carter Center. And then for the next 30-some, almost 40 years, this couple became, I believe, in our lifetime, one of the greatest humanitarians that ever were as a couple. She did things for women's rights and women's health all over the world. The president and first lady, they lived and died in the same brick 3-bedroom, 2-bath home that he built when he came out of the Navy. And all that power and influence and whatever he had, and she had as first lady, they turned that into the Carter Center, which then in turn went out throughout the world. I think any of us would be proud and be honored and be hopeful that we would have a fraction be viewed as the legacy of those two great people, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. That's how I think of them.
There's one other thing I wanted to throw in because we really haven't mentioned it, and that's what both Jimmy and Rosalind Carter did with Habitat for Humanity. They have built homes all around this country of ours and outside the country as well. And he was doing it well into his 80s. And apparently this was something that, in fact, I saw a photo of him, or actually it was a video of him after he had taken a fall, and he was wearing this huge bandage on his forehead. And he was out there apparently the next day or the day after back building homes again. And he had the hammer and he had the saws and he did it all. Again, it goes back to always doing it for others rather than for himself. And guys, with that, that's going to do it for today. Our special thanks to Scott Westerman for being our ringmaster today, for making the show always look professional. Once again, we want to thank our friends Alan Bliss at the Jacksonville History Center for their sponsorship, and thank you as well. Now, before we go, there's one other thing about Jimmy Carter which we have to mention, and that is Jimmy Carter was known as the rock and roll president. And it's not because he loved the music that came out of his loving state of Georgia. He was a fan of Bob Dylan, the Allman Brothers, Marshall Tucker, Jacksonville's own Lynyrd Skynyrd, Charlie Daniels, John Denver, and especially his very good friend, Willie Nelson. It's said that during the Iranian hostage crisis, that when Carter needed to settle down and deal with the stress of the Oval Office, he would turn on Willie Nelson's music and that would settle him down right away. So to close out our podcast, here's a little bit of Willie and President Carter. And thank you all for being with us this week. We'll see you again next time.
When Willie Nelson wrote his autobiography, he confessed that he smoked pot in the White House. And he says that his companion was one of the servants at the White House. Actually, was one of my sons.
With all the odds against him, he still did what he thought was right. That's not a bad pattern for all of us to follow.
Human rights, the right to live like a human, that's something that President Carter tried to make real with his foreign policy.
We now had a president that started to see the world the way we saw it.
His love for music makes sense to me because music is the voice of the heart.
One of the reasons that musicians were drawn to President Carter, he was a man of the earth. For God's sake, he was a peanut farmer.
That was the music of change and dissidence. There was a risk politically to that, and it didn't matter to him.
I think music is the best proof that people have one thing in common, no matter where they live, no matter what language they speak.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mike's on Mike.